So anyway, the final verdict is Chopin gets the award for the better of the two composers. Who is the better composer, Bach or Chopin? Who wins the composer competition? You know, this will be a really fun video because I would like you to leave comments below this video and leave me your thoughts and your theories as to how we can compare and contrast Bach and Chopin's music. This is a really interesting comparison. You know, before I made this video, I didn't even research YouTube. There may be videos like this up there already, so if there are, this is just another one to add to the mixed bag here. So, who was the better composer, Bach or Chopin? Well, you're probably thinking, since I have the name Bach Scholar and everything is Bach and I'm all about Bach, you'd probably expect me to say Bach is the better composer, but not necessarily. No, we need to define composer. This is the main thing we need to do, is define composer. So in chapter 3, okay, I have a couple books here. In chapter 3 of my recently published Tempo and Duration in the Music of Bach, Uncovering J.S. Bach's Science of Tempo, Symbolism, and Proportion. In my recent book here that took me over 30 years to research and write, you know, this is my crowning achievement, which is I just published like a week ago. So in this book, in chapter 3, I devote chapter 3 discussing, it's called Bach's Musical Science and the Imitation of Nature. And what I do is I quote a lot from the very well-known Christoph Wolff from Harvard University. Christoph Wolff wrote the Johann Sebastian Bach, The Learned Musician, published in the year 2000. Very fine biography of Bach. And so my chapter 3 basically just takes from Professor Wolff and freely quotes from Professor Wolff. You know, I'm not stealing anything. I'm freely quoting from him. So let me read to you. This is very important. We need to understand this in order to understand what a composer is. So in order to start really comparing Bach and Chopin, honestly, we need to really think, what is a composer and what does that entail? So I'm going to read, I have my book in front of me here. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 3 of my recently published Tempo and Duration in the Music of Bach. And of course, most of this comes from, I'm citing Professor Wolff from his biography here. So, Bach's Musical Science and the Imitation of Nature. In his biography, or actually my main heading is Bach, the Musical Scientist. In his biography, Johann Sebastian Bach, the Learned Musician, Professor Christoph Wolff begins with a 10-page essay, a prologue titled Bach and the Notion of Musical Science, which sets forth the thesis that Bach preferred to refer to himself as one who produces works of musical science rather than a mere practitioner of music. Wolff writes, quote, "Some 2 months after his 52nd birthday, Johann Sebastian Bach opened a copy of a new, fashionable, and deliberately progressive music periodical and found himself the subject of a fierce attack. 'Mr. Bach,' he read, 'is the most eminent of the music makers in Leipzig.' So began an unsigned, controversial piece of music journalism in the form of a letter, published in 1737, and while the sentence hardly strikes us today as inflammatory, the article's author and editor of the periodical, a 29-year-old upstart named Johann Adolf Scheibe, actually a pretty well-known figure in the time, knew that the terms eminent and music maker contradicted one another. Eminent and music maker. Think about that. So, Wolf goes on, of the numerous critical points of this vitriolic yet ultimately inconsequential piece of early music criticism, what offended Bach the most was being referred to as a musicant. That is the German word for a mere practitioner of music, like a music maker. But Bach also had his defenders. In an elaborate response published the following year, Johann Abraham Birnbaum, a lecturer in rhetoric at Leipzig University, immediately took issue with the utterly inappropriate label musicant as applied to Bach, who apparently was enraged by Scheibe's assault. So it goes on and discusses how Bach really was offended to be called a music maker. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to get to Bach and Chopin, but I have to cover this first. Bach considered himself not as a composer per se. Bach was a musical scientist. And I show in my book that the part of science that Bach was a part of was architecture. He was a musical architect. So he used architectural proportions and things to attain what he wanted to attain in his music. It was very systematic, mathematical, and highly planned. So, I spend about, it must be 60 pages, at least 60 pages on Bach's cantatas, where I show in my analytical system that I use for my book, I show that Bach organized his cantatas in a very highly systematic fashion, where it almost becomes predictable. Well, not almost, it becomes predictable when you study like the numbers of measures and the tempos and all that. You can really piece together what Bach was trying to achieve. And it was all, he wanted to achieve a sense of unity in his work, architectural unity. Bach was a musical scientist, and I think a musical mathematician too, and also a musical architect. So I wanted to emphasize that here, and that chapter is very important in my book because it lays the groundwork for why Bach would do such a thing in his music. Why would Bach want to organize all his music so mathematically in such a highly controlled fashion? Well, Bach himself said that he sort of was bragging in a way about how he was creating a well-regulated church music. And this was Bach's own words, a well-regulated church music. It's a very popular citation from Bach. And so we know that Bach used a system. He was very mathematical. I show in my book that, once again, that Bach was very mathematical and systematic. I show Bach's system. Now let's get to Chopin. Now let's get to Chopin. Do you think Chopin had a mathematical system? Do you think Chopin planned like durations of time to be proportional in his works? Do you think Chopin did anything of that nature? Absolutely not. This was something that I could expect. If you're a musicologist or a music historian, or something about music history, you'll discover that if you know my book, and you know the argument of what I'm trying to show that Bach did in his music, this is very Renaissance. I mean, this is things that would not be surprising to be found in Renaissance music. And in the Renaissance period in the 1400s, composers were there was a big quest for figuring out how everything fits together, and there was a music theorist by the name of Johannes Tinctorus in the 1400s, and he wrote this treatise on proportions in music. And it's sort of like similar to what Bach was doing, that I show what Bach did in his works here. So in essence, Bach was kind of like a Renaissance composer, in that he wanted to highly control the formal dimensions of his works very mathematically. So Bach was a highly mathematical and systematic composer, as everybody knows, but I show exactly how he was systematic and how he was mathematical in my book. Now, okay, now let's get to Chopin. Chopin did none of that. None of that. Chopin was not a music scientist. He was not a musical architect. Well, maybe some of that, but come on. Chopin, we all know, was the master of harmony and the master of melody, and quite good at counterpoint too. I mean, Chopin was not a genius at counterpoint, but Chopin did know counterpoint very well, and he studied Bach. And so, okay, if you had to ask me my favorite composer, it would probably be Chopin. Chopin would get the prize. Chopin wins, Bach loses. Because as much as I love Bach, it's mathematical, it's mechanical, it's structured, it's just the way it is. I mean, what is it? It's just the way it is. And I show that in my book here. I show how Bach was how he highly regulated and controlled all the temporal aspects of his music, tempo and duration, time management. I mean, it sounds weird to us today, but Bach was not really a composer. Bach was more like a musical scientist. He created works of musical architecture. I mean, I know that's not very romantic, but even me, Bach scholar, if I had a choice between a Bach prelude and fugue and a Chopin nocturne, I'd probably choose the Chopin nocturne. I mean, really, I know I'm Bach scholar and I love preludes and fugues and everything, but Chopin was the great composer. Chopin was the master of harmony and melody. Well, so was Bach, but Chopin was in a different way. So in my opinion, Chopin was the greater composer. It depends on how you define composer. And Bach was the greater of the musical mathematician and musical architect. Okay, so you have boring, mathematical, dry here, and you have inspired, beautiful, romantic here. I mean, that's just the way it is. They're two totally different cans of worms. I mean, you can't even compare them. Chopin and Bach. So it's sort of a trick question because it all depends on how you define composer. What is a composer? Is a composer just like a sort of a music maker who dabbles and sort of writes out songs? Or is a composer somebody who seriously gets into the science of music? And well, in a way they're both composers, but in a way they're not. It depends on how you define the word composer, I guess. So it's just very interesting. It's a very interesting topic in that Bach, look, I've spent 30 years of my life on this, over 30 years of my life writing this book that this is the thing I want to be remembered for. This is the only book that matters to me out of all my books. And having now written it and seen what Bach did with his music, it's sort of, in a way, it takes the fun away because I've figured it all out, and we know Bach's intentions. I mean, we know exactly how fast he wanted his music to be played now because I figured it all out. So it's no mystery anymore. I guess it would have been better maybe if I wouldn't have written this book. Then we would have never known Bach's tempos, and we would have all been in the dark, and we can do whatever we want and have fun with his music and play it as fast or slow as we want to. And, but maybe I just shouldn't have even published this stupid book, I mean, it makes Bach no fun. It just takes all the fun away. It's all math, all formulas, math. That's what Bach was. Bach followed a system. Bach was a highly mathematical, systematic composer. I'm using the word composer is used differently in this context than when I say Chopin was the great composer of nocturnes. See, but Bach was not the great composer of cantatas. He was the great architect of cantatas, or he was the great mathematician of cantatas. That's what he was. That he was the great architect of cantatas. See, he was Bach. It's a totally different thing. See. So anyway, enough of that. I don't want to, dwell on it too much, but leave your comments below. It's a very interesting topic. So anyway, the final verdict is Chopin gets the award for the better of the two composers.